Welcome back to part two of religious liberty. I'm excited to continue in our progress of learning about religious liberty. Well, the problem with government and religion merging is that to defy varied beliefs within the church or with the understanding of the religion is to defy the state. And whenever that happens all throughout history, somebody is going to get murdered. It's just how it happens. Because when you put the two together, and it becomes about power and it becomes about the government making all the decisions of what a person should believe, then it becomes against the law to believe anything else. So when we talk about freedom of religion, it comes back through history, through from the Roman Catholic Church, from Constantine to the next emperor that murdered people for believing other things. I mean, people were just murdered back and forth. This also was in England. In England, our founders and a lot of the historians and a lot of the history of England went back and forth through Protestantism and Catholic, and it went back and forth with people being murdered a lot. Actually, the Pope had instigated a lot of this as well. He was actually even placed kings, he placed leaders, he held those leaders to account to do his bidding. Even the King of Spain came against Queen Elizabeth for being Protestant. And so you have all these factions going on. During Queen Elizabeth's reign, the Pope said to kill her was no sin. And to act like that we can ignore the laws of God to achieve a political purpose is wrong. It's wrong. But see, what they don't understand is the laws of God are really made inside the individual from the heart. And so without that, you cause this cosmic clash of events. Now, the Puritans in England, they wanted to purify the church. The pilgrims that came over to America at Plymouth, they actually were separatists. They wanted to separate from the church. They wanted to separate from the hierarchy. We're talking about years where you were made to go to church. You paid taxes at church. You were penalized. Things happened to you if you didn't go to church every week by the king's demand. There were certain things that you could not do by force. By force. And so by the times the Puritans got to, and I'm not, the Pilgrims, they wanted to separate. They made Plymouth. Then later on in 1630, 1,000 Puritans leave England to make the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were Puritans. They wanted to purify the church, and when it didn't purify, I mean, they would break windows, they didn't want to see images, all of that kind of stuff. And when it didn't purify, then what basically happened was they wanted to go to the New World. So they got a charter from the king, and they went to the New World in 1630, and they wanted to build Zion on earth. Now, they still had the ideals that government was there to keep the biblical teachings pure. Government was there to make sure we did not have error. Government would be there to stop all error of humans, and the law would be used to basically put fear in the hearts of people so that they would practice the biblical commands. And so when we get there in 1630, a guy by the name of Roger Williams shows up in 1630 in Boston at the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then he moves to Plymouth, to the Plymouth Plantation with the Separatists. While he's there, they have him teach, they have him preach, and they talk about what a wonderful scholar he is. But while he's there at Plymouth, he starts questioning the king's authority to actually give the charters to the land. And he realized that the Indians were not paid by the king for this land. The charters were given by the king, but the king had not purchased the land from the Indians. And he gets really upset. And he gets so upset that while he's at Plymouth, the separatists don't understand, and they say, well, we don't understand exactly what he's saying. We got this. We're sent here by divine right of the king, because those mentalities were still there. But Roger Williams was being woken up in the heart about true Christianity. And so he goes back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he begins to talk to the Puritans about how they cannot force people, because it's not true Christianity if it's by force. It's got to come from the heart. And he was a Puritan. You got to understand, he was very devout. But he believed that you don't force people, that it is not real if we force people. Of course, they excommunicate him, and they push him out, and then eventually they go to his home. And when they go to his home, they have rough men rough him up and all that good stuff, which was a violation, because he learned from individuals like Cook from England, and Sir Francis Bacon. And Cook had made a statement that above the king was a man's home. A man's home is his castle, meaning that private property is a place where the king should not be able to come. Therefore, private property is above the will of the king. Of course, you would have had to have been a lord to have it, but Cook and them really believed that. And so when they came into his home, he now sees the same thing happening, the same political government system in the name of religion, except without a king, but with elders and magistrates of the church. They tell him that they will cut out his tongue. They tell him that they will cut off his ears. They tell him that they will brand him. And so what happens is Roger Williams runs off to escape. And while he's in the wilderness, the Indians befriend him. And when they do, he is astonished that God sent savages to help him. And he understood that the savages were not necessarily savage, that the Puritans were going to have a problem. He then, by 1636, he gets a charter. He purchased land from the Indians. He purchased it, got a charter, and he builds Providence Plantation. It's what it's called. But there he begins to understand. He sees two fault lines going through the basic of liberties that have to be established. The first one is the proper relation between church and state. And then the other fault line of rights was the proper relation between state and individual. And I'm sorry to say right now that we are losing the idea of individual. We are losing that idea. And even the church, there's separations, but it all starts with the individual in America. And then the church and the state, and he has these two fault lines that are running down this center. And you got to understand, as America develops, it begins to talk about religion as various Protestant denominations. We weren't talking about other religions. These were supposed to be Christian-based, but yet they still had the mentality of the Catholic Church that tortured and the king that tortured and all of that kind of stuff. Roger Williams did not. He builds the state of Rhode Island. And so he calls for the separation of church and state. It wasn't like a big wall. What he's talking about is how it works. He was talking about that state cannot force people to practice a certain way and use power and force. And so when we talk about Roger Williams, you need to research him, read about him, understand who he was, okay? He made something called soul liberty. Soul liberty is what he called it. Liberty of mind, of will, of conscience, and believed that God was to call to the hearts of men. He said forced religion is a problem because we're going to force people to come to church that don't want God. Don't want God. And yet he did believe in preaching the gospel for the hearer to decide. Okay? And he did believe in a public toleration and respect for others, but he also believed in others should respect the majority, and the civility of law. And so this is just a little part about Roger Williams. And we're going to hit a little bit more next time when we come back on some history of religious liberty. See you next time.